Good morning. I'm really honored to be with y'all this morning, and I want to thank Charlotte and Anton for inviting me to share in this time of worship with you at Atlanta Mennonite Church. While I am not a Mennonite, my own experience being raised in the Catholic worker tradition means that my life has been deeply rooted in Christian nonviolence, which I know is a core value in the Mennonite Church as well. And that is what I hope to explore together as we reflect on the gospel message that we just heard. So I'll start by sharing a story that my dad loves to tell. When I was 4 years old, I attended preschool at our church. One day, when we went out to the playground, I turned, pointed to a room in the back of the church, and said to my teacher, "That's where we stayed when we were hiding from the police." I wish I could remember what my teacher said in reply, or at least her shocked facial expression at that moment. I can't remember, but my dad does remind us frequently. Similarly, whenever my dad visits Atlanta, he makes a point to tell anyone who will listen his own unique kind of dad joke. He starts by saying that he lived in Atlanta for 2 years, but that he didn't get out much. He waits a beat, and when the recipient of his joke inevitably responds with a nod or giving him a quizzical look, he quickly goes on to explain that he was living in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So my dad's time in prison and our subsequent hiding at our church were consequences of his participation in the Pershing Plowshares, a protest against nuclear weapons that took place on Easter Sunday in 1984. During this protest, he and 7 others, including a Quaker minister and a Catholic nun, broke into a nuclear weapons facility carrying hammers and baby bottles that contained their own blood. Spilling the blood and denting equipment with the hammers, they sought to symbolically disarm the weapons. Their actions were meant to enact Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, which reads, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." My dad, his co-defendants, and the many plowshares activists who came before and after him remind us that our call as Christians is always to position ourselves in absolute opposition to violence, war, and bloodshed, even when that position requires taking on risk and sacrifice. When they cut the fence and entered into the secure area at the nuclear weapons facility, they were not walking alone. No, they knew that they were surrounded by a cloud of witnesses and by the communion of saints, holy men and women who came before them and shared in their conviction. The conviction that Christ's body, broken for us, compels us to act against the breaking of others' bodies. St. Oscar Romero, a martyr from El Salvador that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who ultimately was assassinated for his solidarity with the poor and oppressed people in his country, put it this way during the blessing of communion at Catholic Mass. He said, "May this body immolated and this blood sacrificed for humans nourish us also, so that we may give our body and blood to suffering and to pain, like Christ, not for self, but to bring about justice and peace for our people." While living like Jesus did is not easy, we too have a multitude of saints and a great cloud of witnesses to whom we can turn for strength and courage. We can draw on examples of holy men and women who have been resisting empire and crying out against violence since the very beginning of the Christian faith. Theologian and church historian C. John Cadeau writes that in the early days of the church, the conviction was that, quote, Christianity was incompatible with the shedding of blood, either in war or in the administration of justice. In other words, the early church understood being nonviolent as synonymous with being Christian. So in the gospel we heard today, Jesus is about to be taken into custody, and we know brought to a gruesome and violent death at the hands of the state. I imagine if there were ever a time when violence were justified, Peter's defense of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane would have been it. But when Peter strikes the guard who comes for Jesus, Jesus responds with an intimate gesture of healing towards the guard. We didn't actually hear that in Matthew's version, but he heals the guard's ear that Peter cuts off. And in a stern warning is issued to Peter that violence will always breed more violence. So Jesus disarmed Peter, and in doing so, he disarms all of us. So while Jesus commands us to reject violence, Jesus' direction is not to be passive. 3 days after Jesus died, we know that he rises from the dead. He rose from the dead. And that resurrection definitively shows us that violence never has the last word. Instead, Jesus returns and greets his disciples with the greeting, "Peace be with you." His resurrection is proof that love is always stronger than the forces of death. His resurrection compels us to bring about the kingdom of God by embodying faith, hope, and love when we are faced with fear, hopelessness, and death, which, as Charlotte mentioned, is how I feel listening to the news. Another Saint Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker tradition, was a pacifist, but fervently maintained that the call to Christian nonviolence was an active one. She said, "We have inherited the Beatitude, and our duty is clear. The Sermon on the Mount is our Christian manifesto." So that is rooting our response to violence in the Sermon on the Mount, which means in a world that is broken and mired with hate, we accompany the poor. We comfort those who mourn. We aim to remain meek. We always seek justice and mercy. We attempt to be pure in heart. We live as peacemakers. And the Sermon on the Mount tells us that when we do these things, we will suffer and we will face persecution, but that one day we will see the kingdom of God. So the question for us as Christians is, how do we live as peacemakers? I am not here to suggest that all of us are called to break into nuclear weapons facilities, so you can exhale, nor that we are all called to martyrdom. But I am certainly saying that each of us can embrace Christian nonviolence in our lives. Another saint, you know I'm a Catholic now, who is not a Christian, but is someone who has taught me much about my calling as a Christian, is the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. One of Thich Nhat Hanh's famous books is Peace is Every Step. I think one of the first ways we can be a peacemaker is to cultivate peace in our own hearts, in our own families, in our own communities, and in our own day-to-day lives. But I also maintain we cannot stop there. To be a peacemaker is to radically embrace the call to Christian nonviolence, and I think that that means lifting up our voices and being willing to interrupt violence with our bodies when we see it happening. I wish that there were less opportunities for us to practice this, but unfortunately, our world is rife with need. Here are some suggestions. Challenge yourself to take concrete steps against gun violence in the United States. Visit men and women detained at Stewart Detention Center, where the state enacts violence against them daily. Join the efforts to save the Atlanta forest, where police have already murdered a nonviolent protester as they sat with their hands up. Raise your voice for a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. Oppose the death penalty. Attend a rally outside the jail to call for its closure after 10 people have already died there this year. This isn't a comprehensive list, but you get the idea. Raising our voices, embracing peace with every step we take. To close, I want to share one final quote from St. Oscar Romero. He's one of my heroes. He said, "Let us not tire of preaching love. It is the force that will overcome the world. Though we see the waves of violence succeed in drowning the fire of Christian love, love must win out. It is the only thing that can."